Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Paulitics Show, a show, as I'm sure you could have guessed, about politics. So today is going to act as both an introduction to what the show aims to accomplish and what we're going to actually tackle on the first show, which is why I think Joe Biden needs the progressive vote in order to win the general election, how he should go about achieving the progressive vote, and things of that nature. So before we jump right into that, I first want to speak to a little bit about the show, what I aim on doing. And simply, I think the aim of this show is to more so not sway your opinion, but really just advocate new perspectives, worldviews, and angles that may be contradictory to like what we know as a society, and rather offer new perspectives, angles, and worldviews that we may otherwise, find contradictory to what we know, that may make some of us uncomfortable, and that may make us question our own beliefs. And I plan on doing this by not only speaking myself, but as well as inviting guests onto the show. So for example, this coming Friday, I have congressional candidate Russ Cirincione coming on the podcast. We're actually doing a live stream this coming Tuesday, so make sure you go check that out. It will be on the YouTube channel being live streamed, but if you happen to miss that, you can always tune on Spotify and on YouTube this coming Friday. Again, that's congressional candidate Russ Cirincione. He's running for New Jersey's 6th congressional district. Make sure to come check that out this coming Friday. So now we're actually going to go ahead and jump right into the actual show itself, which has to do with Joe Biden's chances of getting the progressive vote. And I feel like this is a really rarely talked about topic because typically, younger voters, which tend to be the most progressive, rarely show out to vote. However, in a year that is 2020, and there are millennials now who are slowly aging, and the typical trend is the older you get, the more likely you are to go vote. And as millennials are tending to get older, they're more likely to go out and vote. But they still are progressives, and we need to give them a rationale, a reason to vote for Joe Biden. And in my view, and in their view as well, it is not good enough for Joe Biden to run on the platform of, at least I'm not Donald Trump. He needs to run on something different and unique. I understand, and so do they. They also understand that Donald Trump is a menace. He's a terrible president. But you need to be able to run on something. Otherwise, they're not going to go out and vote at all. They need an incentive to go vote for the person, not just because there's someone that is the current status quo, which being the president. So how do we achieve this goal? How does Joe Biden and the campaign achieve this goal? Well, first, in order to, back up those claims I just made, I think we first need to really look at Joe Biden's enthusiasm rate. And his enthusiasm percentage as of March, and I understand that was 2 months ago now, but his enthusiasm rate was 24%. Now, 24% for a presidential candidate of one of the two major parties is abysmal. In fact, Hillary Clinton had a higher enthusiasm rate, and she still lost. Now, you can blame whatever reason she lost, whether it be if you buy into the Russian narrative, if you buy into the email narrative, or perhaps if you just buy into that she was an unlikable candidate narrative. But regardless, she still lost, yet she also had a 12-point higher enthusiasm rate, being 36 percentage points. Now, to be fair, that was after the email scandal. But that said, if you look at Joe Biden's current enthusiasm rate, he has a 45% enthusiasm rate among Joe Biden's supporters. That is not saying anything about the independents who might be leaning a moderate independent who's trying to decide between a Donald Trump and a Joe Biden. That says nothing about them. This is strictly between Joe Biden's supporters themselves. So 45% say that they are extremely or very excited to vote for Joe Biden. That's not a high percentage point, especially among Joe Biden's supporters themselves. Meanwhile, 55% of Joe Biden's supporters say they're only mildly or not that excited. And that's a 10-point deficit right there. 10 points. You got to make that up if you're trying to beat Donald Trump, who has an enthusiasm rate within the Republican Party, an approval rating within the Republican Party of 95%. That's insane for any president to ever accomplish such a high approval rating within their own party. Yes, you're always going to have those never Trumpers, the 5% of never Trumpers within the Republican Party, or those that have left the Republican Party because of Trump, but a 95% base turnout. That is all he needs. But, let's keep that 45% of Joe Biden supporters that are extremely or very excited to vote for him in the back of our minds for a second. Well, you also have, looking back at 2016, you have a CNN poll of Hillary Clinton achieving a 46% approval enthusiasm rate. Yet, she still lost. And this is Joe Biden's enthusiasm rate hovering at 45%. I understand that's 1 percentage point less, but it's still less. But that's even without the Tara Reade scandal of Joe Biden supposedly sexually assaulting Tara Reade, becoming a mainstream story. Right now, that's really only being covered on a few different stations, Fox and independent media sources. CNN's rarely talking about it. MSNBC, Joe Scarborough talked about it on the on Morning Joe very briefly, but nonetheless, it was still covered very, very, very briefly. So this is before the Tara Reade story gets out to the general public. So imagine what supporters are going to think once this actually gets out. The enthusiasm rate is going to drop tremendously, in my view. But we also have to look at why the progressive vote matters. Because if he's having a difficult time maintaining his base of 45%, being enthused about voting for Biden, we also have to look at the other candidates that have not necessarily dropped their 2020 campaigns for the Democratic primary, but we also have to look at someone like a Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders supporters, about a third of them say they're going to vote for third party. Now, what this means is unclear. It could wind up being the Libertarian candidate, Justin Amash, if, Amash does wind up taking the Libertarian nomination. It could be Howie Hawkins or Jesse Ventura. Both of them are running for the Green Party nomination. So it very well could be either one of those options. If they do wind up voting for third party. Now, in 2016, about 15% of Bernie supporters voted for Trump, around 15%. The same amount, around 15%, claim they're going to vote for Trump again in 2020. Now, Bernie supporters are about 30% of the Democratic Party, as a general rule. So that's roughly about, I'm not very good with math, so let's just, round here. Let's say that's, about, I'm not sure, but we're just going to go about and say that it's a majority of, you're not a majority, it's a plurality of voters that Biden's going to need to garner in order to win the general election, because you're going to need those young voters, you're going to need those millennials in order for Joe Biden to wind up winning the general. So how does Joe Biden go about winning those 15% of Bernie voters saying they're going to vote for Trump? How does he go about those 1/3 of Bernie voters saying they're going to vote for a Green Party candidate or a Libertarian candidate? And also, how are you going to sway those who are simply just going to leave blank the presidential ballot and going to vote for their congressman, their senator, their local legislature, and things of that sort? So how do you convince those people to vote for Biden? Well, the rule is simple. Progressive voters, contrary to popular belief, tend to be policy-based. No one likes Bernie Sanders because he's an ancient man. He's about 4,000 years old. No one likes him because of that. No one likes because that he doesn't do his hair. No one likes that he has a hunch. No one likes that about Bernie. They like him because of his policies. They like Nina Turner because of her policies. They like AOC because of their policies. They don't care about who they are as a person as long as they endorse the policies that are important to them. Now, what kind of policies those entail? Well, of course, one of the key characteristics of the Bernie campaign, one of the key policies, is his endorsement of Medicare for All. Now, during the crisis that is COVID-19, from February to March, the support for Medicare for All actually rose around 9%. And That was a 9-month high for Medicare for All, according to polling. And it also rests around 70% approval among Democrats. So it's highly popular among the party itself. I mean, after the primaries, when you had Super Tuesday, for instance, and Super Tuesday 2, when they did exit polls and they asked about Medicare for All, they found that Medicare for All was surprisingly popular among the party in the mainstream. They found that to be very surprising. Now, if you ask someone like me, I don't necessarily find that surprising because the majority of Americans actually support Medicare for All. The majority of Republicans support it, 52%. But that's a different story. So that's how you achieve it. Now, Joe Biden has been on the record multiple times saying that he does not favor Medicare for All. In fact, even once saying that he'd veto a Medicare for All plan if it landed on the Oval Office desk. So whether or not I doubt that he'll come around to supporting Medicare for All, but that's a key component of how he needs to win the progressive vote. Because, for instance, every Democratic candidate is going to say that they favor a universal healthcare system. But there's a difference between what constitutes a universal healthcare system and what constitutes a single-payer system. Because if you have a single-payer system, you're having one system, the government, being the sole insurance provider. Yes, you can have supplementary insurance through private insurers, but you're going to have primarily the one sole insurance provider, a single payer. However, a universal program doesn't necessarily equate to a single-payer system. I believe it's a fallacy to try to achieve it without a single-payer system, but Joe Biden doesn't necessarily believe that. For instance, his plan, according to many sources, will leave around 3% of Americans uninsured, which roughly translates to 10 million Americans. Now, if we have those 10 million uninsured Americans, they're likely to suffer during this pandemic that is the coronavirus. So, how do we achieve a universal coverage which is something that Joe Biden says he wants to achieve without endorsing Medicare for All? Well, this is a strong policy preference among progressive voters. So I believe that that's the first step in Joe Biden needing to accomplish it before he tries to garner any support among progressives. Because again, he can't run on the premise of, at least I'm not Donald Trump. Yeah, so that's the first belief that I have regarding Donald and regarding Joe Biden's what he needs to do to get the progressive vote. The next thing he's done, and this was a few months ago, he said he was for legalizing marijuana. However, in that same sentence, he then corrected himself to say decriminalizing marijuana. Now, there's a stark difference here, and I believe that if you are a progressive candidate, you need to be in favor of legalizing marijuana. In other words, someone should not go to jail because they want to be able to smoke up, right? That shouldn't be the case. Now, the other part of it is Donald Trump has expunged the records of some people. The First Step Act was a good first step. But also, I forget her name in particular, but there was a Super Bowl ad about her. I think her name might have been Johnson, last name Johnson. And she let Johnson out of jail for a non-violent crime. Now, this is something Obama did in his last few days in office. You know, Joe Biden's old boss. But Joe Biden has also been on the record saying that he's not going to expunge the records of those non-violent offenders. Now, Donald Trump has been doing this throughout some of his administration. The First Step Act accomplished this, which is something he touts now through Super Bowl ads as campaign ads. And also the thing I think that he did for, I believe her name was Johnson again, Kim Kardashian, the person related or a colleague of Kim Kardashian. So in other words, if you're going to run as a Democrat, and Democrats are on the left, you cannot let Donald Trump outflank you from the left. You need to always be on the left of Donald Trump. And on this particular issue, it seems that Donald Trump is to the left of Joe Biden. So don't let that happen, Joe. You need to be on the record of saying, yes, I am going to expunge the records of nonviolent drug offenders. No one should go to jail for wanting to smoke marijuana. And then we should also declare that the days of reefer's madness are also over. You shouldn't go to jail for doing that, period. We should legalize marijuana. There shouldn't be a stigma around wanting to get high, for wanting to tweak your conscience, as Kyle Kalinske says. So again, just briefly, don't let Donald Trump be to the left of you on any issue whatsoever. And that goes right into the next issue as well, as the next two issues that I have premises. Don't let Donald Trump be to the left of you on foreign policy. Yes, I understand that he killed General Soleimani of Iran back in January. It feels like January. This year feels so long. But you don't let him be to the left of you. He's said multiple times that he wants to get out of the wars. Now, has he ramped up offensively in these foreign regime change wars? Absolutely. But use that against him. You know, both of you are realistically, in policy preferences, are both in favor of expanding the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other Middle Eastern countries. I mean, under the first year of the Trump administration, before they took off the rules showing about civilian casualties, the rate for civilian casualties and drone strikes in general went up roughly 400%. But Obama, in 1 year in office in 2016, dropped 29,000 bombs in Middle Eastern countries. Joe, you can't continue this policy that many Americans are against. You, for instance, also voted against for the Iraq War. You can't allow that to be your modern mindset too. We need to get out of Iraq, get out of Afghanistan. Those wars, especially Iraq, were built upon false premises. Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. We went in and we keep moving the goalpost every time we keep staying there, and people are questioned on it. So this is what allowed Tulsi Gabbard, who was a representative from Hawaii, allowed her to gain notoriety, or at least some notoriety, in the Democratic primary of 2020, because it was her commitment to end regime change wars. Now, again, as I said, Biden had happened to vote for the Iraq War. But that was almost 20 years ago. You can use that and say that you've learned, you've changed, and that you're willing to remove all troops out of Iraq, but instead that you vouched for leaving troops there. We can't leave troops there because it's an absurd idea to keep moving that goalpost. The idea then is that permanent occupation will occur. Now, why do I mention Tulsi Gabbard from before? And why is this a key thing among progressives? Well, it isn't necessarily just for progressives, but it does allow voters to pick up Tulsi Gabbard's support, and as well as some Republicans, specifically paleo-conservatives. So an example of a paleo-conservative would be like someone like a Tucker Carlson, who actively campaigns against these wars in Middle Eastern countries. So it's a method of picking up some Gabbard supporters, some Bernie supporters who I know are vehemently anti-war and actually went to Bernie in 2020 because of his new strengthened foreign policy stance in comparison to 2016. But it also allows for some Trump voters who voted for him in 2016 because he wanted to end the wars. Now, granted, yes, he did speak out of both sides of his mouth on that issue. But the next issue is something Trump actually has signed into law, and many Americans have benefited from thus far. Now, if it's doing enough, that's a different story. But the issue I'm talking about is a stimulus package for the coronavirus. Because every American that wasn't a dependent the age of 17 or wasn't eligible in terms of how much they make per year, the annual salary, received $1,200 from the federal government. Now, this $1,200 is clearly not enough. If you're living in a state like New York, California, New Jersey, or any other high income or high rent, high mortgage state, it is going to be nearly impossible for you to live off of $1,200 for 2 months. It's impossible. It can't happen. So what has Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and there's one other senator, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, done? Well, they've endorsed a plan that gives $2,000 to every American in the United States, a universal stimulus package of $2,000, not $2 million, $2,000 to every American, a universal package, truly universal. Now, Joe Biden has not endorsed any form of UBI, even temporary UBI. Now, this looks really bad, especially in a pandemic where there is a 14.7% unemployed rate, and 40%. And this, over the course of the next few months, it's likely that 40% of all small businesses are likely to go belly up permanently, likely to permanently go bankrupt. And in addition to that, Joe Biden also needs to call for a better COVID relief plan. Calling for things like freezing rent or even canceling rent, freezing overhead costs, and making sure that if you go furloughed, that you're still getting paid. That if you are now unemployed, that you're still getting paid. And that after this crisis is done, because this crisis is not just a public health crisis, it's an economic crisis, that once the public health crisis is dealt with, that we have a federal jobs guarantee program to make sure that there is no uninsured American, that we can make sure every American has the possibility to get a job if they need a job. Because that will be a huge stimulus to the economy as well. It'll help so many Americans, and it will help so many jobs, and it will be able to build up our crumbling infrastructure, which historically has done terribly well when graded by, I think it was the Civil Corps of Engineers, and we repeatedly get D's, D minuses, or D pluses. That's unacceptable for what is supposedly the wealthiest nation on the face of this planet. Now, one of the other key factors I believe that Joe Biden has to achieve when picking a VP choice, because again, this is a strong issue, is Joe Biden has gone on the record multiple times saying that his vice president is going to be a female. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? A female vice president, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I don't believe in the notion that the whole country is a racist, sexist, misogynistic country. I don't believe in that notion. I think that the main problem that creates a divide among the country tends to be income inequality. However, so choosing the female vice president candidate, there's no problem there in my view. But what Joe Biden has to do is he has to make sure it is a progressive individual, or at least center-left. And the reason I specify that this person needs to be a progressive is because Joe Biden is not a progressive. Joe Biden is a super centrist moderate candidate. He doesn't support the policy programs of Elizabeth Warren. He doesn't support the policy preferences of Andrew Yang. He doesn't support the policy preferences of Bernie Sanders. He is a centrist candidate. And what happens is typically when you are running in a general election, regardless of what party you are in, you typically wind up running to the center. Now, if Joe Biden runs even further to the right, he's going to be a moderate Republican. Donald Trump does not run to the center during elections. We've seen this multiple times. He stands his ground regardless of where that ground is. So if Joe Biden's trying to run to the center, well, you're going to lose even more of that enthusiasm rate that we spoke about earlier, that 45%. Because that 45% is very excited to vote for your moderate program. But the 55%, the progressive base, is not. So you have to make sure you maintain your base before you get independence. And let's face it, this is really messed up to say, but it's unfortunately the sad reality. Joe Biden is rather old, and there is certainly some sort of cognitive decline present with Joe Biden. So how do we remedy this? Well, it's likely that, either he only serves one term, which I think at one point he actually committed to, or that, he picks a great vice president. And I don't necessarily know who that could be. I know on the short list it's been rumored that Whitmer of Michigan has been rumored, Stacey Abrams on the list, Kamala Harris on the list. But, at the end of the day, Kamala Harris is named Kamala for a reason. She prosecuted people for smoking marijuana. She was in favor of three strike policies when she was the Attorney General of California. So that's not necessarily a good case. Now, I don't know too much about Whitmer of Michigan, but what I do know is that Michigan is one of the highest states with the rate of COVID-19, and that it would be a really, really bad look if Whitmer were to take up the vice president position, given that her state is struggling. So to give up governing and instead go campaigning, that would be a really bad look, and it would look like a completely careerist move rather than caring about actual people. And regarding the last one of Stacey Abrams is rather unproven. She didn't win the gubernatorial race when she ran for governor of Georgia. She lost to Brian Kemp. And she's also not all too progressive. She keeps pitching herself on interviews, I think at least 7 times within the past 2 weeks. She's gone on different interviews and said that she would make a phenomenal vice president to Joe Biden. Well, I thoroughly disagree with that. She's not very a progressive candidate. In fact, she's kind of the opposite of a progressive candidate. She is just like Joe Biden, a rather centrist candidate, but that happens to be a female. Now, as I said, I got nothing wrong with you being a female vice president candidate, as long as you are progressive, because at the end of the day, that's how you're going to have to win. You need the progressive vote in order to win Joe Biden. You can't pick a candidate like Hillary Clinton did with Tim Kaine, who is a boring white man in that of Tim Kaine, who has the personality of a cardboard box. You can't pick that. So what you need to do is you need to pick someone exciting. You need to pick someone like Elizabeth Warren, who's a progressive and who has infamously a plan for that, a plan for everything, a plan for all those things I spoke about before, except for foreign policy, because Elizabeth Warren isn't all too great when it comes to foreign policy. Elizabeth Warren, throughout the 2020 campaign, has had a foot in both the progressive camp and the centrist establishment camp. So she has a foot in both worlds, unlike the other 2 candidates I'm about to suggest. The next candidate I'm about to suggest is Tulsi Gabbard. Now, I know a lot of progressives aren't going to be too happy with Tulsi Gabbard, but at the end of the day, she is for the policies that I just mentioned. She's phenomenal when it comes to foreign policy and tends to match the progressive vibe that Bernie gives off with ending the wars. And she also is a woman of color. If that's the angle that Joe Biden is trying to get for the identity points in terms of identity politics, that's a great angle to take. Is it unlikely? Absolutely, because at the end of the day, she voted no on impeachment. She's voted no on critical issues that the Democratic Party has typically been lockstep with. In 2016, she was the only congressional representative to endorse Bernie Sanders. Now, that's big, and it's unfortunate that she didn't after she dropped out in 2020. Instead, she endorsed Joe Biden, but perhaps that was a signal to Joe Biden to put her in a position. Lastly, and this one is probably around the same likelihood, so very unlikely as a Tulsi Gabbard candidate, but Nina Turner. For those of you that don't know who Nina Turner is was a former state senator from Ohio. Now, she is also one of the co-chairs of the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign. She works with Our Revolution. She works with progressive causes all the time. She is, at the end of the day, a progressive woman of color. She is probably the best chance of keeping the Bernie base from voting for Donald Trump and voting for Harry Hawkins and Jesse Ventura if they would have run, or Justin Amash if he gets the nomination for the Libertarian candidate. So at the end of the day, as I have mentioned multiple times now, that base needs to be secured for Joe Biden to win. And then you can wind up focusing on these other fronts, such as the moderate Republicans looking for an alternative to Donald Trump. So at the end of the day, I think those are the main issues that a Joe Biden needs to do in order to win the general election. Now, of course, there are other things he needs to do. In my view, he also needs to go ahead and start telling us who he plans on putting in these cabinets. Because I've heard multiple times now arguments from Joe Biden supporters that we aren't voting for Joe Biden if progressive, because I've heard multiple progressives not wanting to vote for Joe Biden. So I've inquired, well, who are we voting for then? Because again, Biden supporters say we're not voting for Joe Biden. We're voting for his Supreme Court candidate. We're voting for his confirmations to the Department of Education, to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the Department of Defense, the Department of State, to all these various different departments. That's who we're really voting for at the end of the day. So my question in return is, who are these people? Because Joe Biden hasn't said anything. Joe Biden has only told us the greatest hint about his Supreme Court nominee would be a black woman. Now, that's fantastic, Joe, but we need to know who this person is going to be. Because if it's going to be someone who's a centrist in the form of a Merrick Garland, well, what excites a progressive about that? And if we're relying on the premise that you need the progressive vote to win, because it is a big chunk of the Democratic Party, progressives, well, why would you want a Merrick Garland type centristy candidate to fill in a Ruth Bader Ginsburg seat? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is the most progressive Supreme Court justice we've ever had. Stephen Breyer is roughly the same age as RBG. So if Biden were to win the election, it's likely that he would fill 2 seats, a Ruth Bader Ginsburg and a Stephen Breyer. Now, what do we do from there? I need to know, and we need to know as a progressive cause, who Joe Biden is going to be nominating to these positions. Who's he going to nominate to the Secretary of Education to replace Betsy DeVos? Who's he going to replace for RBG and Breyer? Who's he going to replace for Pompeo of State? Who's he going to replace for Esper of Defense? We need to know these things if we're not truly voting for Biden at the end of the day. And I tend to subscribe to that message that we're not going to vote for Biden because of the cognitive decline in the rationale that the vice president nominee is probably more important than the presidential candidate himself, being Joe Biden. So those are the variety of factors that we ought to look at when we're voting in 2020 as a progressive cause. Has Joe Biden achieved what I'm calling for? Has he achieved a good coronavirus response plan? Has he achieved the calling for ending the regime change wars? Has he called for supporting a Medicare for all system? Has he called for a UBI system? Has he called for the legalization instead of decriminalization of marijuana? Those are the things we ought to look for. And I understand at the end of the day, Trump's a menace. He's a nuisance, and he's done nothing well, very little well, because he has done some stuff that I'll get into in a later episode that is good for this country. And at the end of the day, if Joe Biden can adopt those policies, there should be no reason we don't vote for him. Now, I understand the rationale for not wanting to vote for him, but at the end of the day, there is a good cause to vote for Joe Biden if he were to adopt these policies. And a lot is at stake with another term of Donald Trump. So I ask Joe Biden, if anyone ever sees this episode, which is doubtful, that you take an inquiry of looking into adopting these policies. Because at the end of the day, it's a progressive cause that is going to win the election. You need the progressive vote. You can't divide the Democratic Party on election day. You can't have a third of Bernie supporters, a third of progressives going to vote for Jesse Ventura. You can't have 15% of Bernie supporters going out to go vote for Donald Trump. And what's even worse is the group that stays home. We need to encourage the vote. And you don't encourage the vote by playing right of Donald Trump. You don't encourage the vote of saying, at least I'm not him. No, you need to endorse actual substantive policy. And that's, in my view, why Joe Biden needs the progressive vote and how Biden will need to get that progressive vote in order to win the general election. So I want to thank you all for tuning into this first episode of the Paulitics Show. I know it was a rather short episode, being around 35-ish minutes so far, but I want to thank you all for tuning in. This was my first episode, and in the next episode, we're going to be tackling the constitutionality of stay-at-home orders, whether they're a good thing, whether they're a nuisance, and whether or not they're going to wind up crippling the economy. You'll find out my view, as well as my view on the constitutionality, whether or not they're a good thing, in the next episode. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for tuning in. And if you like this episode, please drop a like, please drop a comment, and share this with your friends, your family. And at the end of the day, I know we're living through scary times and unprecedented times, but please stay safe, be well, and have yourselves a good one.